You're listening to the Bible for Normal People, the only God-ordained podcast on the internet. I'm Pete Enns.
And I'm Jared Bias.
We've been working on our children's Bible for over a year, and it's a project we are extremely proud of. And guess what? The official release date for God's Stories as Told by God's Children is March 25th, so mark your calendars.
Informed by biblical scholarship, inclusive, and deeply respectful of children's imagination and intelligence, God's Stories as Told by God's Children is a storybook Bible you'll wish you had when you were a kid.
It contains stories from over 50 contributors, and these biblical scholars, theologians, and practitioners represent diverse religious traditions, locations, and lived experiences, mirroring the many voices we find in the Bible. You'll find stories from the Hebrew Bible, Apocrypha, the New Testament, including age-appropriate information about the history and context, as well as conversation starters for each story.
With no underlying theological or denominational agenda, God's Stories as Told by God's Children allows parents to introduce children to their own beliefs and traditions in conversation with the stories found inside. It goes on sale March 25th, 2025, but in the meantime, you can get a free story download today at thebiblefornormalpeople.com/God's Stories.
Well, we've come a long way in Genesis, haven't we, folks? Yes, indeed we have. We've gone from the creation of the heavens and the earth all the way to the story of Jacob, which was our previous episode. You might also remember that the editor of Genesis divides the book of Genesis into 10 sections, each marked by the phrase, "These are the descendants of." The last of these sections is found where we begin today, which is the lineage of Jacob, the younger son of Isaac, who has also been renamed Israel. And this last section begins in chapter 37, verse 1, and it continues to the end of Genesis, so it's a long one. Furthermore, not to confuse things, but although Jacob is the one this section of Genesis is named after, and he factors into the action, of course, but this section of Genesis is best known as the tragedy and triumph of his 11th born son, Joseph. One note I've been strumming through this series is how Genesis, though posed as a story of the deep past, is at least as much a commentary on the period when these stories were written or compiled, namely during the period of Israel's divided monarchy, which began around 922 BCE and continued to the exilic period, which covers 586 to 539 BCE, and then the period after that known, of course, as the post-exilic period. One example of this that we peeked at in the previous episode concerns the line of Jacob's elder brother, Esau, who would be the eponymous ancestor of the Edomites, Israel's neighbor to the south. And Esau's lineage is given in chapter 36, and you may remember that Genesis 36:31 introduces us to, quote, "the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites." This statement makes no sense unless the writer lived in a time when Israel's kings were currently ruling or had ruled at some point in the past. And this would have been absolutely no earlier than about 1000 BCE, and likely much later, perhaps even in the exilic and post-exilic times. So Genesis looks back over the centuries to talk about the days of old. And I know I might be beating a dead horse here, but getting on board with this idea is central to reading Genesis through ancient eyes. That is, through the eyes of those who wrote the story as we have it today. So with that being said, let's move on to the story of Joseph, which begins in chapter 37. Israel's national history will be one big sibling rivalry event. Stories of sibling rivalry between the brothers is really the story of the civil war of the nation in miniature. Like so much of what we've seen in this series, Genesis really does serve as a preview of coming attractions. Here we see again the 10th and final, "These are the descendants of" section, this one dedicated to the line of Jacob through his favorite son Joseph, firstborn of his favorite wife Rachel. Joseph will, of course, play a vital role in the survival of his extended family. That's what this whole section's about. And we may know it as one of the better known stories of the Bible, the inspirer of children's coloring books and Broadway musicals alike. Donny Osmond and Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat should ring a bell. But this story is really about much more than Joseph. It is the bridge that takes us from the descendants of Abraham, a family, to Israel as a nation. It is about the line of Jacob, now renamed Israel. We are nearing here the story of the birth of a nation, where all this stuff in Genesis is aiming towards. Now, if I may, I want to make clear once again that by saying things like Genesis is the story of the birth of a nation, I'm not claiming that Genesis is history in any sense that we understand the word in modern parlance. To say as much is not to diminish Genesis, but to try to understand it as an ancient book written by ancient people asking questions of meaning for themselves. So my aim here, as it has been throughout the series, is to accept the narrative as it has been written in an attempt to understand the theology of the writer, but also to dig down a little bit and to bring into the conversation insights of modern biblical scholarship. One of those issues, an ever-present one, concerns the authorship and editing of Genesis. And we've covered this ground before, and if it's too redundant, I do apologize, but let me recap quickly, especially for those who might be jumping into this series at this late point. Genesis is composed of different traditions, and this has typically been listed as 4 traditions. And these traditions emerged in Israel's history in different times and places and were then collected and edited together at a later stage. This is, once again, the academic issue of source criticism, which is alive and well throughout Genesis, including the Joseph story. Although some hearty debate exists among Hebrew Bible scholars, of those 4 traditions, 3 can be seen in the Joseph story: P, E, and J. The other one is D, and that's not found here. J stands for Yahwist, because this author's preference is to call God by God's name, Yahweh, which, again, not to make things more confusing, but Yahweh is spelled with a J in German, which is where this theory really took root, and hence it's called the J source, not the Y source. P stands for the priestly source because of this author's attention to priestly types of things, whether temples or sacrifices or things like that. E, the third source that concerns us in this Joseph story, stands for Elohist because of that author's penchant for using the generic divine name Elohim when referring to Israel's God. And at least that's the case in Genesis. That changes in the book of Exodus, which, we're not going to talk about here. So this theory of sources has really helped explain why the story looks so uneven and inconsistent and actually contradictory at times. Now, if you'll allow the metaphor, when you sew together a coat made from patches of material, you can see the seams where they were sewn together. We see those seams in Genesis, which strongly suggests a sewer, an editor, a compiler artfully bringing these patches together to make a coat. Okay, maybe I just overdid the metaphor, but we'll see a couple of examples of this in the Joseph story, and I hope it'll be pretty clear. First, a quick overview to remind us all of what is happening in the story. After annoying his elder brothers, young Joseph finds himself sold to traders and then winds up in Egypt. He seems to have made quite an impression because he becomes a slave to Potiphar. He is the captain of Pharaoh's guard. But one day, Potiphar's wife tries to get him to sleep with her. And when he refuses, she claims that he tried to take advantage of her because no one else is in the palace. So this lands Joseph in prison, where he is eventually released because of his reputation for interpreting dreams. And Pharaoh has had quite a doozy of a dream. Joseph delivers the bad news that his dream is not good. A famine is coming, but Joseph also comes up with an idea to avert disaster. So when the famine comes, Egypt is sitting pretty, but no one else is, including Joseph's father Jacob and his brothers and their families all the way back in Canaan. So the brothers make the trek to Egypt to get grain and to meet Joseph, though they don't recognize him, and so Joseph makes them squirm for a time until he reveals his true identity. Thus, Jacob and his descendants come to live in Egypt, where things are apparently cozy for a few hundred years until the growing population of the Israelites are enslaved, and that is the beginning of the Exodus story. Okay, now let's go a little deeper into some of the highlights of this story. Joseph, like most every other character we've encountered so far, has some pretty serious flaws, but still turns out to be a key figure in God's plan. At the outset, Joseph is a spoiled daddy's boy, seeing as he is the eldest of the two sons of his favorite wife, Rachel. Now, you may remember, too, Jacob had children by another wife, Leah, and their two slaves, Bilhah and Zilpah, but only two by Rachel. So anyway, Jacob even gave Joseph this beautiful robe, which he wore around his brothers, flaunting his favored son status. To make things worse, this 17-year-old even tattles, for some reason, on his elder brothers. The tension is building. I hope that the theme of sibling rivalry is ringing loud and true in your ears at this point. We've seen this sort of thing already, haven't we? Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, and now Joseph and his brothers. What gives? Well, remember from past episodes, Israel's national history, which deals with the monarchy, having kings. You don't have a nation without kings. Israel's national history will be one big sibling rivalry event. As the story goes, the 12 brothers will in time become the 12 tribes of Israel. And these sibling tribes will, wait for it, not get along too well. Just like the brothers haven't been getting along since the beginning of Genesis. So as the biblical story goes, the kingdom of Israel, which was unified under David and Solomon, quickly split into two kingdoms, most of the tribes making up the far larger northern kingdom, and one tribe making up the south, Judah. A side note, the Hebrew Bible is a little confusing here, and it's hard to know what to do with this, but sometimes only Judah is mentioned as the south, but other times Simeon is included, and Benjamin sort of fits into that a little bit as well. Simeon is easily forgotten because its borders seem to be swallowed up entirely by Judah's. It exists entirely within Judah's borders, so who cares about them? And Benjamin has sort of an odd relationship with the tribes, sometimes seeming to be northern and other times southern. So functionally, there's only one tribe that makes up the southern nation, and that's Judah. So anyway, the stories of sibling rivalry between the brothers is really the story of the civil war of the nation in miniature, sort of like a preview of what's going to happen. Like so much of what we've seen in this series, Genesis really does serve as a preview of coming attractions. So Joseph's brothers hate him, and not just because of the snappy clothes, but because Joseph is a bit of a spoiled jerk. He's had two dreams with the same message. He will one day rule over his brothers. Having dreams is one thing, but Joseph seems intent on letting his brothers know about it. So he heads out intentionally to where his brothers are working to break the news to them. How does he think this is going to go? Does he think they're just going to welcome this news with open arms? What was he thinking? Was he thinking? But now it's 10 angry, hard-working brothers against one cocky, spoiled 17-year-old. So one day, the brothers see him coming yet again from a distance, and they say, they're getting tired of this stuff. Here comes that dreamer. Let's kill him. But after some debate, cooler heads prevail, namely eldest brother Reuben, and he declares, quote, let's not take his life. Don't spill blood. Throw him in this pit. Don't lay a hand on him. Okay? So instead of killing him, they strip him of his robe that he is so proud of, and they throw him into a dry well where he would surely die a slow death of starvation. Now, there are 3 points to ponder here in this scene. First, it's hard to read this without thinking of the story of Ishmael, Abraham's son by Hagar. Remember, he and his mother, that's Hagar and Ishmael, were driven off into the wilderness with meager provisions to meet certain death. And Joseph is Abraham's great-grandson, and he finds himself in a similar situation where he is sold into the hands of some Ishmaelites, descendants of Ishmael. So there's a bit of this story that sounds like payback to the line of Abraham through Jacob, that an Ishmaelite now is going to come out on top, not be the victim. Second, we have a rather glaring source-critical issue here going on. Reuben, as we just saw, saved Joseph from death. Let's not take his life, don't spill blood, throw him in the pit, don't lay a hand on him. That's verses 21 to 22. But just a few verses later, in verses 26 and 27, Judah also saves Joseph from death in words similar to Reuben's. What profit is there if we kill our brother and cover his blood? Let our hand not be on him. These two rescues of Joseph from death seem to be a blending together of two traditions, namely the E tradition, that's the one that stars Reuben, and the J tradition, and that's the one that stars Judah. Now, if that doesn't convince you, that's fine, but the third issue might, and it concerns how Joseph got down to Egypt. The issue is whether Joseph was handed over to passing Ishmaelites, or was it Midianites? Those aren't the same kinds of people. And the text says both. We read in chapter 37 and verses 25 and 28 that Joseph was sold to an Ishmaelite caravan. But in verse 28, we also read that it is Midianite traders who were passing by. In fact, verse 28 is rather confusing. Here's what it says. When Midianite people, merchants, passed by, they, presumably the brothers, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, the well, and sold him to the Midianites? No, to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So again, which is it? Who took him down to Egypt, the Midianites or the Ishmaelites? You have to admit, this isn't the clearest bit of writing, and most biblical scholars explain this as more evidence of different traditions that later editors brought together, even if awkwardly. These seams are pretty glaring. But regardless of how Joseph got down to Egypt, the brothers get some quick cash and get rid of their little problem. It's a win-win for them. To cover up their crime, they dip the coveted robe in goat's blood and then tell their father that his favorite son has been ripped apart by wild animals. Here we go again, folks. Yet another brotherly incident that involves blood, think Cain killing Abel, and deception, think Jacob deceiving Esau. And again, Father Jacob, the great deceiver himself, gets another dose of his own medicine. Like his father Isaac believed his lie, Jacob falls for the ruse of his sons, and he is devastated. His favorite son from his favorite wife is dead. Little does he know that Joseph is making his way down to Egypt to be sold as a slave to Potiphar. So that's how the story begins. But before continuing the story of Joseph, the editors of Genesis carve out some space for telling a seemingly random and totally unrelated incident involving one of Joseph's elder brothers. This is the story of Judah and Tamar in chapter 38. It feels like we're moving off topic from the story of Joseph to some random event concerning Judah that happened around the same time as verse 1 puts it. And in a sense, this story definitely interrupts the flow of Joseph's arrival in Egypt. But might the editor of Genesis have a reason for telling this story at this point? And I do think there is something interesting going on here. We just have to pay extra attention. In this story, we find Judah, the fourth of Jacob's sons, the ancestor of the tribe of Judah. He leaves his brothers, sort of like Joseph did, by the way, not by force, but he sort of leaves the presence of his brothers. And he happened upon a certain Hira, the Adullamite. That's Adullam is a town, right? So Hira, the Adullamite. And by the way, both those names will be important in a minute. That's why I mentioned them. He also happened upon an unnamed Canaanite woman, known in the story only by the phrase daughter of Shua. Shua is the name of the father. So Judah, of course, marries her and has three sons, Onan, and Shelah. Spelled E-R, is the eldest, and he grew up and married a woman named Tamar. By the way, I need to interrupt this just quickly here because think about this story from a logical, historical point of view. Judah leaves his brothers and was gone long enough from his brothers to have had three children of marrying age. This doesn't add up, at least. It doesn't really fit with what comes before and the action that comes after. But I think the editor knew that. I think the editor is goading us into paying attention to what's going on here. I think he's daring us to find some meaning in this story for why he placed it here. It's so abrupt and so jarring. Well, anyway, who married Tamar, is killed by Yahweh because of his wickedness, whatever that might have been. The surviving elder brother, Onan, refuses to do his legal brotherly duty to impregnate Tamar so that his deceased brother's line can continue through her. He refuses to do that, so he too is killed by Yahweh. Now, side note, Onan, he thwarted the plan by, quote, spilling his semen on the ground. So, no, this is not a biblical proof text against masturbation, but a story of Onan refusing to continue his brother's line by means of coitus interruptus. That is the, quote, sin. That masturbation was once referred to as onanism just simply speaks to a misunderstanding of what's going on here in this story. Anyway, with two dead sons, Judah is very reluctant to have his youngest son, Shelah, meet the same fate. So he delays their marriage until Shelah is a bit older. Now, apparently, Judah was too slow in keeping his promise to let Shelah marry Tamar. And as time goes by, during which Judah's wife, again referred to as the daughter of Shua, I keep coming back to that, folks, it's a very important phrase, but she dies. So Judah's now a widower. And Judah then goes off to the town of Timnah. Tamar, his daughter-in-law, hears of this, and in order to get what she should have, Shelah as her husband, she devises a plan. She gets dressed up and heads to Timnah and positions herself on the road near Timnah so Judah can see her when he enters the town. And he did, though he mistook her for a prostitute. Her face was veiled after all. And by the way, I hear loud echoes here of Isaac not recognizing his own son, Jacob, because he had this flimsy disguise to make him sort of smell like his brother Esau. Again, a lot of deception going on in these stories. Now, as part of the negotiation, she asks Judah for his seal, his signet ring, also his cord and his staff as a pledge to guarantee that he will pay her the agreed-upon fee for sex, which was a goat kid. Okay. Judah accepted the terms, and Tamar wound up getting pregnant. Finally, right? Some justice is done to Tamar. She's at least pregnant. And later, when she is clearly showing, Judah, this is back home, he's shocked. Shocked, I tells you, and was ready to have her executed for having done such a horrible, vile thing. This is when she produces the seal, the cord, and the staff, proving that Judah is the child's father. And Judah admits his mishandling of the whole affair. You know, how noble of him, right? Now that he's caught red-handed, he admits it. Anyway, Tamar later gives birth to twins, Perez and Zerah, the former, Perez, being the ancestor of none other than David. David. The plot thickens. David is the clue as to the purpose of this story here in Genesis. And there are a couple of moving parts here, so bear with me. We have here a deeper connection to David and this story than merely the birth of David's ancestor. Rather, this story of Judah and Tamar echoes two stories in David's life, both in 2 Samuel, that involve injustice and sex. And this is David's rape of Bathsheba and his son Amnon's rape of his half-sister Tamar. Careful readers have long noticed the similarities between Judah in Genesis 38 and David, a descendant of Judah. I see at least four. First, most obviously, both Judah and David are involved in a troubling or unjust sexual encounter involving a daughter or daughter-in-law named Tamar. Second, both Judah and David are shepherds who go to Adullam and encounter characters with tantalizingly similar names. Judah encounters, as we saw, Hirah, Hirah, that's in Genesis 38:1. And David, this is now in 2 Samuel 5:11, David encounters Hiram. Very similar names. One ends with an H, the other one ends with an M. It's like someone writing a fictional story of government corruption that involves spying with a hotel named The Waterway and a president named Richard L. Dixon. You're like, wait a minute, this is about the Watergate break-in, duh. See, that's why Judah encountering Hirah of Adullam is pretty close to David, a descendant of Judah, encountering Hiram in Adullam. The intention there is to draw subtle connections between this story and Genesis 38 and things in the life of David. Third, both David and Judah are involved in a sexual sin, followed by a forced admission of guilt, right? In Genesis 38, it's Tamar who sort of tricks him into admitting his sin. And in David, in 2 Samuel chapter 12, it is Nathan's prophecy. He tells a story whereby David winds up actually condemning himself. And fourth, and I think most telling and most intriguing, is the identification of Judah's wife, referred to simply as I've said, the daughter of Shua. Shua is her father. In Hebrew, daughter is bat, spelled B-A-T. But actually, it should be spelled and pronounced B-A-T-H. So we have here the Bath of Shua, which in Hebrew is simply Bath Shua. Oh my. Do you hear it, folks? Bath Shua is so very close to Bath Sheva, or pronounced in English, Bathsheba. Only, just like Hirah and Hiram, only one letter separates them. And in fact, this is, when I first saw this, I couldn't believe what I was reading, but those boring genealogies in 1 Chronicles chapters 1 to 9 that no one in the right mind reads? Well, 1 Chronicles chapter 2, verse 3 and chapter 3, verse 5, they identify the woman in the David story not as Bathsheba, but as Bathshua. I just find that intriguing, right? So let's just tie this together a bit. The story of Judah and Tamar in Genesis 38 is intended, I believe, to evoke images of David and of the later monarchy, right? We have here another preview of coming attractions as we've been seeing all along in Genesis. The abrupt insertion of the story of Judah and Tamar, specifically here near the beginning of the Joseph story, is harder to explain logically, but on the other hand, why not? Why not stick it right towards the beginning? It's very intrusive nature here that might be simply an intentional attempt to draw attention to it and its connection to David. You've got to stop and think about, what is this doing here? And readers have had to stop and figure out what's going on ever since they started reading this story. Also, in Genesis, Judah's star is on the rise. More on that in a moment. But he is a character that grows in prominence in Genesis. Inserting a David-ish story about the up-and-coming Judah makes sense, given as how David will come from Judah's line. See, again, do you see how mixed up the monarchy is with the book of Genesis? And, maybe just another sort of a side note here, but another possible reason for the placement of this story at this point is to contrast Judah's questionable behavior in a sexual episode, and thereby also questioning David's behavior because they're parallel characters, and contrasting that to Joseph in the next chapter when he refuses the advances of Potiphar's wife. Genesis never ceases to intrigue me. So after the story of Judah, we go back to the action. We have sort of a meanwhile back at the ranch moment, and we return to the story of Joseph, and we're now in chapter 39. And he quickly becomes a trusted man to Potiphar, this commander of Pharaoh's army. And he's put in charge of Potiphar's house. And here we see an echo of something way back in Genesis chapter 12. An echo of God's promise to Abraham that I will bless those who bless you. And in chapter 39, verse 5, we read, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house, Potiphar's, for Joseph's sake. Too bad Joseph is a total stud and Potiphar's wife has a thing for him. So one day, while they are alone in the house, she tries to seduce him, but Joseph refuses. And unfortunately, she has a good hold of his tunic, so when Joseph tries to get out of there, he leaves without his clothes. And this is the second time he's lost his clothing, right, folks? Remember the Technicolor Dreamcoat? Yeah. And with tragic results. The scorned and guilty woman lies to the household servants and to Potiphar, telling them that it was Joseph who tried to seduce her. Another deception. Anyway, it's worth pointing out that this scene here of Joseph and Potiphar's wife is similar to that of an Egyptian text called The Story of Two Brothers, where the wife of an older man tries to seduce a younger man and then accuses him of rape. Now, the degree of connection between these two stories is certainly debatable, but it still leads us to question, at least it raises the question, whether this element of the story of Joseph is historical. Did it really happen, or is this more of a stock motif one uses to tell stories like this? And my inclination, in all honesty, is toward the latter. But I also feel pretty strongly that deciding that issue isn't the most important thing for understanding the story itself and what the writer is trying to do. Though, this story of two brothers business is similar to another kind of thing that happens in the book of Exodus. So not to go too far afield here, but remember, as an infant, Moses is placed in a basket and found by royalty along the banks. And scholars have argued for a very long time that this incident is similar to an incident in the so-called legend of Sargon. Sargon was an Akkadian king who lived around 2300 BCE. Okay, back to the story. So, who's Potiphar going to believe? His wife or Joseph? Well, we know the answer to that. He throws Joseph in jail, just like his brothers threw him in the pit. And let me just tease out a little bit more all this going down business. See, Joseph has downward journeys. So he goes down to the pit, then he goes down to Egypt, and now he goes down to jail. That word down is used in Hebrew. But each time he goes down, he's also brought back up again. He's raised up, so to speak, from the pit then by defying the odds and becoming Potiphar's right-hand man. And then after prison, he is restored to high command. And hang with me here, folks. Pit is a metaphor, a common metaphor in the Hebrew Bible for the grave. And so one can certainly understand early Christian interpreters of the Bible seeing in Joseph a foreshadowing of Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. That's not what the story means originally, of course, but that thematic connection is something that early Christians looked for with a lot of energy to see, are there any elements in the Hebrew Bible that can not predict Jesus, but just sort of foreshadow things that Jesus winds up doing himself. And they found one here. Anyway, at least for now, it looks like poor Joseph, he can't catch a break. Or can he? Well, we've already learned that Joseph has coded dreams, and in those days, the ability to interpret dreams was a valuable art. And it just so happens that while Joseph is in prison, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, who are already incarcerated, each have a dream that they simply can't make heads or tails of. So Joseph interprets the cupbearer's dream. He'll be released from prison and restored to Pharaoh's good graces. And then Joseph then interprets the baker's dream. And he's really eager to have his dream interpreted too, but his is less promising. He will have his head chopped off and stuck on a pole for bird food. Both dreams come true, and Joseph asks the cupbearer to put in a good word for him with Pharaoh. And in line with Joseph's bad luck, well, the cupbearer just forgets. That is, until Pharaoh starts having some dreams of his own that need interpreting. And this is the beginning of Joseph's rise to power, his final resurrection, as it were. Now, we live in a world of I Know What You Did Last Summer or The Walking Dead and no fewer than 7 Saw movies. We might not be creeped out by dreams of skinny cows eating fat cows, or, if you can picture it, skinny stalks of wheat eating fat stalks of wheat. But to Pharaoh, these dreams are considered omens and deeply disturbing. I mean, this can't be good, right? So his own magicians cannot tell him what the dreams mean, and that's their job. So the cupbearer says, funny thing, I remember I was in prison with this Hebrew guy who's quite good at interpreting dreams. So Pharaoh summons Joseph. Hey, I hear you can interpret dreams. Well, actually, Joseph replies, God interprets dreams. I'm just the messenger. And this is a wonderful moment because Joseph is in the process of learning some humility about his dreams while staring at his prison walls. And he's gaining wisdom and maturity through necessary suffering. He's learning to be a true leader. So Pharaoh relays his dreams, nightmares really, to Joseph about scrawny cows, scrawny wheat stalks, eating fat cows, fat wheat stalks. And Joseph immediately knows what they mean. Egypt will have 7 years of abundance, that's the fat cows and fat wheat stalks, followed by 7 years of famine, the scrawny cows and the scrawny wheat stalks. And the famine will be much worse than the abundant years, which is the whole business about the skinny ones eating the fat ones. So Pharaoh takes a chance and he asks the prisoner Joseph what he thinks they should do about it. And Joseph says, well, save up for a rainy day, to store up food during the 7 years of abundance so they will have enough to ration out during the years of famine. Good call, Joseph. Very wise, very kingly, ruling kind of thing to say. You're coming along nicely, Joseph. You're really sort of growing up here. So Joseph, the Hebrew prisoner, he saves Egypt from destruction. Not a bad gig if you can get it. Several generations later, however, these same Egyptians would turn on the Hebrews and enslave them. Right? Not a very nice thing to do for a group of people that bailed you out all those years ago. But that's a story for another book of the Bible. That's a story in Exodus. So anyway, while Joseph is promoted from slave to Pharaoh's right-hand man in charge of preparing for the famine, Jacob and his growing family are still back in the land of Canaan. And the famine hits, and Jacob starts to feel the pinch. He sends his remaining sons, except for Benjamin, that's his youngest, his darling baby boy, and the only other son of his favorite wife Rachel. He stays at home, but he sends his remaining sons to Egypt to see if they can buy some grain from Pharaoh. And we are now in chapter 42. And, oh my dear people, please tell me you remember this go to Egypt because of a famine idea. This episode of a famine, which sets up the end of Genesis that leads to Israel's enslavement in Egypt, well, this episode mirrors Abraham and Sarah's trek to Egypt way back in Genesis chapter 12 because of a famine. These two stories frame this action in the book of Genesis. And just like in that earlier story where Sarah is a guest in Pharaoh's house, Joseph's brothers will soon find themselves in their own awkward situation of being under Pharaoh's hospitality. That same scene in Genesis 12 comes up again big time in the book of Exodus, where this whole story is headed, when the Israelites are first guests and then enslaved to Pharaoh. And you can check out, if you want, how Genesis 12 foreshadows the Joseph story, which is covered in the second Genesis episode of this series. So Joseph's brothers, they come to Egypt, and wouldn't you know it, they must meet with Joseph, who is now the one in charge of rationing the food. And he recognizes them immediately, but they don't recognize him. Again, another moment in Genesis of a surprising lack of recognition. Really? They just have no idea? Oh, well. So instead, they bow down to him because he's, a big deal Egyptian, and that fulfills the dream he had as a boy. The story could have come to a quick end here and everyone lived happily ever after, but the writer has much more to say in this story. The brothers now, appreciate this, they're completely vulnerable. But instead of revealing who he is, Joseph plays a little trick on them. He accuses them of spying. It seems he has a score to settle. So he strikes a deal. Show me you are honest men by bringing back this youngest brother of yours you say you have. I think he just wants to hang out with his little brother here. But anyway, the brothers, though, they're not really excited about this deal since they know Jacob will not want to take the risk. He's a little gun shy about losing his favorite remaining child, Benjamin, after having lost the other son of his beloved Rachel, Joseph. But having no real choice, they got to eat, the brothers leave Simeon behind as collateral. And he is bound in chains, and the remaining brothers make their way back to Canaan with a heavy message to deliver their father. The brothers, they do deserve every bit of this. They have to deliver another piece of bad news to their father about another one of Rachel's sons. Only this time it's not a lie. As they deliver the first son to death, they realize they might be delivering this other son of Rachel's to death as well. And I think they must have been pondering this bit of poetic justice on that long journey home. Jacob, predictably, refuses to hand Benjamin over. Can't blame him. Joseph is lost, and Simeon is as good as lost, and he will not lose another son, least of all Benjamin. The thing is, though, the famine doesn't care about any of that. The famine doesn't subside, and they soon run out of grain that they bought on the first trip. So Jacob's hand is forced, and rather than lose all of his family to the famine, he relents out of desperation and sends the sons back with a lot of gifts in the hopes of making sure he gets his Benjamin back. They stay for a while in Egypt and are treated well, and Benjamin, far from being in harm's way, is given 5 times as much to eat and drink as anyone else, sort of replaying his elder brother's spoiled son status. But it's all set up. Joseph isn't going to let them go off that easily. The brothers leave, greatly relieved with all the grain they can carry, but they don't know that trickster Joseph had planted his silver cup in Benjamin's bag and is about to accuse them of stealing it. I keep saying this, but it's true. So much recurring deception in this family. So Joseph's men ride after them, catch up with them, and promptly arrest them for stealing the cup. A scene that clearly echoes Jacob and Rachel's flight from Laban, which we looked at back in episode 4. Right? This is a slightly revised version of that stolen idol incident in the Laban story. So the brothers plead innocence, but it is announced that the one who has the cup will be returned to Egypt as a slave. Joseph is reenacting his own story with the other favorite son, Benjamin, while his brothers helplessly watch. This is just so vindictive, if you ask me. But after the cup is found, they all return to Joseph to beg for his mercy. To return without Benjamin might literally kill their aging father. Fortunately for his brothers, Joseph feels he has punished them enough. So his heart is breaking, and he reveals his identity to them, who they simply can't believe what they're seeing. And in a statement of not only forgiveness, but spiritual maturity, he tells his brothers that all this that happened was God's plan all along. And here's the famous verse. Chapter 45, verses 7 to 8. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and a lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Change a few words in that little speech, and the Israelites could be saying the same thing after the Exodus, and especially after the return from Babylonian exile. God has preserved us a remnant and delivered us from harm. And if you do a word search for remnant in the books of like Ezra and Isaiah and Jeremiah, you can see how closely that idea is tied to Israel's return from exile. I do think that the story of Joseph can be credibly read as a preview of that later episode. And with great joy, Joseph sends his brothers back, and Pharaoh himself invites Joseph's entire family to join him in Egypt. He even gives them the land of Goshen to settle in, the best of the land, which is on the outskirts of Egypt. So the brothers arrive back in Canaan and give Jacob the news. He is stunned and overjoyed. All of the people of Israel migrate to Egypt, and this is where they remain as we end the story of Genesis. And they do quite well for themselves. They prosper, and more importantly, they, quote, are fruitful and increase greatly in number. Genesis 47:27. After all we've seen of these Israelites, one misstep after another, God is still with them, albeit behind the scenes, blessing them and increasing their number, in keeping with the ancient blessing of creation to be fruitful and multiply that we read about, for example, in Genesis 1:28. So as Genesis comes to a close, we see Jacob growing very old and near death. And in his last act as patriarch, he blesses each of his sons and grandsons, beginning with Joseph's two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. That's Genesis 48. He insists, though, on blessing Ephraim, the younger, over Manasseh, the elder. Folks, here we go again. The inexplicable preference of the younger brother to be favored over the elder, which we've seen throughout Genesis and first in the story of Cain and Abel, the first brothers of the Bible. This scene is a glimpse of Israel's future. Ephraim, or Ephraim it's also pronounced, will be one of the names of the powerful northern kingdom of Israel. Right after the monarchy divides into north and south following the death of Solomon, that northern nation, which is sometimes called Israel, sometimes called the house of Jacob, house of Joseph, its other name is Ephraim. The story is, I guess, an explanation for why that tribe in the north, Ephraim, was so prominent and why it was so apparently blessed. In other words, it seems to be an etiology, a story told to explain why things are the way they are. So anyway, in Genesis 49, this is 8 to 12, we see another example of the prominence of Judah in Genesis. There, Jacob says to Judah, he says, Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons, his brothers, shall bow down before you. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and the obedience of the peoples is his. These exalting words of Judah's eventual blessing clearly echo the beginning of the story of Joseph. Just as Joseph rose to power amid opposition and struggle, Judah will be prominent over his brothers. Judah will be the name of the southern kingdom. Judah receives an especially exalted place in Jacob's blessing, for all Israel's hopes will be pinned on a king from Judah. This king's name will be David. It will be David and his line. That's where all this is looking forward to. The blessings given to Ephraim and Judah in Genesis signal the political prominence of these tribes in Israel's future, which is the writer's present. So the book ends with the death of Jacob and then Joseph, and with this, Israel's infancy comes to an end. In the first book of the Bible, and a difficult period of growth is about to begin. The transition from a family, a people, a tribe to a nation is not one that will come easily. It begins with enslavement in Egypt and will end with a divided kingdom and 2 exiles of the north and of the south. And as we've seen, that larger story is already in view throughout Genesis. Israel's ancient story is one of struggle with God and with others. It is also a story of Israel's faith in God, that God will come through for them no matter what. That is the story of Israel as a nation, and it is the story foreshadowed in Genesis. Despite appearances, Israel could count on God in its national struggles, just as Israel's ancient ancestors could. Okay, my friends, thank you for listening and for hanging with me here in this 5-part series in Genesis. And in the next episode, we'll start something else. We're going to talk about another book of the Bible. How does that sound? All right. See you later, folks. Hey folks, I'm excited to announce that I have a new segment called Pete Ruins More Stuff, in which I'm going to take a deeper dive into some of the seemingly random side notes that come up in my Pete Ruins episodes. These extended cuts of the podcast are going to be exclusive to members of our online community and will release the same day as my Pete Ruins episodes. They'll be available via video and will show up in the member-only RSS feed. If you want access to Pete Ruins More Stuff, plus other bonus podcast episodes, and all access pass to every single one of our classes, and a great community, you can become a member of the Society of Normal People today for as little as $12 a month at thebiblefornormalpeople.com/join.
Well, thanks to everyone who supports the show. If you want to support what we do, there are 3 ways you can do it. 1, if you just want to give a little money, go to thebiblefornormalpeople.com/give.
And if you want to support us and want an all-access pass to our classes, ad-free live stream of the podcast, and a thoughtful community of people asking tough questions about the Bible and faith, you can become a member of our online community, the Society of Normal People, at thebiblefornormalpeople.com/join.
And lastly, it goes a long way if you just wanted to rate the podcast, leave a review, and tell others about our show. In addition, you can let us know what you thought about the episode by emailing us at info@thebiblefornormalpeople.com.
You've just made it through another episode of The Bible for Normal People. Don't forget you can catch our other show, Faith for Normal People, in the same feed wherever you get your podcasts. This episode was brought to you by the Bible for Normal People team. Brittany Hodge, Stephen Henning, Joel Limbowen, Savannah Locke, Melissa Yando, Tessa Stoltz, Danny Wong, Lauren O'Connell, and Naomi Gonzalez.